Welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue the story of Japan by talking about the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, which was different from either of our other two shogunates because they had much more power over more of Japan than any of their predecessors. So that brings us to our three objectives. We're going to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the famous three unifiers. We're going to look at the tools used by the Tokugawa to control the daimyo once they had consolidated power. And we're going to look at the cultural developments of the Tokugawa shogunate and how they created and moved Japan towards a more modern culture. So let's first introduce Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was a powerful daimyo, we see him here, who was incredibly ruthless and used this ruthlessness to start gaining control over his neighbors' territories. He would often exterminate entire families, setting fire to their predominantly wooden castles and then simply allowing all the family members to burn to death. These tactics allowed Nobunaga to gain power. His slogan and the phrase put on his royal seal was Tenka Fubu, or all the world by force of arms, basically saying that he was going to force everyone to do what he wanted or they would die horribly. This was effective, but it made Nobunaga significant amounts of enemies, even within his own followers, who thought that his tactics were relatively harsh. But it really didn't matter because Nobunaga was willing to embrace Nanban, or foreign trade. By bringing in Western missionaries and Western traders, honestly, he mostly brought in the missionaries in order to get access to the traders. Nobunaga was able to outfit his army with modern weapons. Here we see samurai practicing with guns, and was able to build a modern navy with cannons. This enabled him to defeat one of his rivals by simply parking his boats outside their castle and then blowing it and then bombarding it until it caught fire and then burned down. So Nobunaga was able to use this powerful foreign technology in order to consolidate a significant amount of Japanese territory. But as we mentioned, this led to a number of enemies turning on Nobunaga, and one of his generals betrayed him. In the ensuing battle with his betraying general, Nobunaga was killed, either in the fire that was set, as we can see here, or potentially by jumping out a window to escape capture and thereby committing suicide. So Nobunaga was killed by one of his key lieutenants, and his quest to unify Japan came to an end. But Nobunaga was avenged and later succeeded by one of his key lieutenants, a guy named Hideyoshi Toyotomi. Toyotomi was a fantastic general, enough so that he was able to rise from being a commoner with no name to being the most powerful man in Japan due to his own military skill and intelligence. Toyotomi was able to kill the assassin who killed Nobunaga and thereby seize control of his territory, and then Hideyoshi simply finished the job, unifying all of Japan under his rule. Toyotomi was a somewhat effective ruler. One of his most important policies was the Great Sword Hunt, by which he went and confiscated all the swords from the peasantry, leaving only the samurai with enough swords to actually fight, and making sure that rebellions against him would be short-lived. He then, hilariously enough, melted all the swords down and made a massive statue of the Buddha. But Toyotomi's rule was not totally successful. He launched an invasion of Korea, which was incredibly expensive and not particularly effective, and he switched who his heir was going to be a couple times, and so it wasn't clear when Hideyoshi died exactly who would take over. And so there was a council, an advisory council of 5 daimyo set up to help figure out the succession, and that did not lead to a unified Japan. The reason it didn't lead to a unified Japan is because a guy named Tokugawa Ieyasu was one of those 5 daimyo, and he had been working behind the scenes to consolidate power. So he quickly overthrew Hideyoshi's young son and seized power in his own right, eventually winning the Battle of Sekigahara which destroyed the last of Tokugawa's enemies and allowed him to claim the title of shogun. With Tokugawa becoming shogun, there were a couple different policies that he set up in order to make sure that the daimyo did what he wanted. The most important was known as the Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance policy. We're going to talk about alternate attendance in class, but just so you know, it involved the daimyo having two castles, one in the new city of Edo, which is today Tokyo, which was Tokugawa's power base. At that castle, daimyo had to keep their families. So if they decided to rebel against Tokugawa, he could simply execute their families in retribution. They also had to travel between their home province and Edo every year, which was incredibly expensive and kept the daimyo from having the money to raise rebellions. So alternate attendance was a way for Tokugawa to control the other daimyo and to ensure that people did what he said. But despite the brutality of Tokugawa's rise to power, the Edo period, as his rule was known, was one of the golden ages of Japanese culture. You started to see the Japanese develop new architectural techniques, including the building of these fantastic castles. Japanese artwork reached its apex during this time period. Japanese theater also evolved during this time period, with both Japanese puppet theater and kabuki theater becoming incredibly popular and ways for the masses to enjoy Japanese culture. So we'll be looking at both of those examples in class. And we start to see a lot of the important Japanese literary works, especially ones that focus on samurai values. And we'll be examining some of those in class as well. One of the other things that happened during this time period is Japanese society became much more fixed as far as social classes. The emperor was still on top, and he was still untouchable, but all of the power was really held by the shogun, who then controlled the daimyo. The samurai during this time period were theoretically warriors, but during the rule of Tokugawa, it was about 300 years of peace in Japan, and so the samurai instead became government officials who helped the Tokugawa rule Japan. The largest class was the peasants, of course. They were the ones who created most of the wealth in that they did the farming and created most of the goods that the Japanese people used. And then on the bottom of the merchants, who were frowned upon, and Japan in general opposed during the Tokugawa period foreign trade. This opposition to foreigners only got harsher after the Shimbara Rebellion, which was a rebellion of Christian peasants pushing for better life and equality. Because as you remember, peasants are stuck close to the bottom of the social hierarchy, and despite the fact that the samurai are living relatively good lives during the Tokugawa period, life for peasants in Japan was never very pleasant. Christianity had spread to Japan through the trade that had been opened up during Oda Nobunaga's reign, and Christianity, of course, taught that all people were equal before God, and so the peasants thought, similar to the way that the German peasants drew the same conclusions during the Reformation, that if all people are equal under God, maybe all people should be equal in Japanese society. They were forcibly convinced that this was not the case when the rebellion was crushed, the castle was burned, Christianity was banned, and significant numbers of Christians were killed. This convinced Tokugawa that these foreign influences were damaging to Japanese society, and so he passed what's called the Shokoku, or closed country policy. The Shokoku was in some ways similar to the Chinese Canton system, in that it only allowed foreigners to come into one port in Nagasaki, and similar to the Canton system, they were only allowed on one artificial island. And so only specific foreigners could come to this one place to trade with the Japanese. And the end result is because Japan did not have the same valuable trade goods as China, most foreigners stayed away. If foreigners tried to break this policy, they were brutally executed, and Tokugawa especially liked to crucify Christians on the beaches where their ships landed, then set fire to the ships and cast them out to sea again as a warning to others. So, Japan entered during the Tokugawa era a period of isolation where Japanese culture grew, but it was separate from the rest of the world, which is going to have some key results and effects as we go forward. So this brings us back to our three objectives. Hopefully you can provide reasonable answers to these questions. And then when we come back in class, we'll take a look at some of the art and culture created by the Tokugawa.